Tonight, we are going somewhere very cold and very quiet and much further back than most of us have ever thought to look. We are going to a wooden village on a plain in Russia, sometime in the long centuries when a person could be born, live an entire life, and die without ever legally being allowed to walk away from the field they were standing in. Before we begin, if you find these stories a good place to rest, subscribe and come back whenever sleep is slow in coming. There will always be another quiet hour waiting here, and there is one thing worth doing before you drift off tonight. Tonight's story is about family lore, about who your people were, and the things that got passed down without anyone writing them down. So when you settle in, leave a comment with the oldest story your family still tells, whatever it is, however small, or simply tell me where your family comes from if the stories have gone quiet. I read them. They are honestly the best part of doing this. Now, let the room go dark and let the fire in the great clay stove burn down to the coals, and let us go and see what it was like. Here is the thing that almost nobody expects about Russian serfdom. It was not ancient. It did not stretch back into the fog at the beginning of everything. It was made deliberately by men in rooms with ink and paper, and it happened late enough that we can name the years. For a long time, the Russian peasant was poor and taxed and worked half to death, but he was not owned. He rented land. He owed his landlord a share of what he grew and a stretch of labor in the season. And crucially, once a year, he could leave. The date was late November, after the harvest was in and the debts of the year were settled. It was the feast of St. George, and in Russian, it was called Yuriev Den, Yuri's Day. For a window of 2 weeks around it, a peasant who had paid what he owed could pick up his family, load a cart, and go and find a landlord who offered better terms. It was not much of a freedom. You had to be solvent to use it, and most people were not. But it existed. It sat in the calendar every year like a door in a wall, and everyone in the village knew exactly where the door was. And then, across roughly 100 years, the door was closed. It was closed slowly and in pieces, and mostly by accident, in the way that terrible things often are. In the 1580s, in the middle of war and famine and a collapsing population, the government began declaring certain years to be forbidden years, in which nobody could move at all. It was supposed to be temporary. The nobility, who kept losing their laborers to richer neighbors and to the wide, empty South, kept asking for the ban to be extended. Then came the question of runaways. If a peasant left illegally, how long did his landlord have to hunt him down and drag him back? 5 years at first, then 15. Then, in the year 1649, in a great new law code assembled by a young czar and a frightened assembly, the time limit was removed altogether. That was the moment. Not a war, not a conquest, not a dramatic decree. A clause in a legal code, quietly deleting an expiry date. From 1649 onward, a runaway could be pursued forever, and because he could be pursued forever, his children could be pursued too, and their children. The bond was no longer a contract you had entered. It was a condition you were born into, and it followed the bloodline down like eye color. There is a Russian saying that survived from that century, and it survived because it was useful, and people said it for 300 years afterwards whenever a hope collapsed at the last second. It goes, "Here's Yuri's Day for you, Grandma." You can hear the whole thing in it. The shrug, the bitterness, the sense of a door that people could still remember, still describe, still point at in the calendar, and that no longer opened. So place yourself now in a village a century or so after that clause was written. You are standing on packed earth between two rows of wooden houses. There is no stone anywhere. The road is not a road, it is a wide track worn into the ground by feet and hooves and sledge runners. And you are, in the language of the documents, a soul. That is the actual administrative word. Landowners were assessed and taxed and ranked by how many souls they held, and a serf owner would tell you at a dinner in the capital that he had 400 souls in Tver province, the way another man might mention the acreage of a farm. Now, here is where I need you to hold two things at once, because holding both is the only way this story makes any sense. The first is that this was a system of ownership over human beings, and no amount of context softens that. People were listed in inventories between the cattle and the furniture. They were transferred as wedding gifts. They were mortgaged to pay for a house in Moscow, staked at a card table by a drunk landowner, and advertised in the newspapers of a European capital. The second is that the people inside this system were not a gray, undifferentiated mass of suffering. They ran their own village governments and voted in them. They kept their own courts, their own calendar, their own law that had nothing to do with the state's law. Some of them founded factories. Some of them became so rich that they bought their own freedom for sums that would buy a palace. And some of those men owned serfs of their own. Both of those things are true. They were true at the same time, in the same villages, sometimes in the same household. And the reason this story is worth an hour of your night is that almost everyone who tells it only tells one half. Settle in. It is a long way, and the roads are bad. Your house is called an izba, and it is made entirely of trees, not sawn timber. Whole trunks, notched at the corners so they lock into each other, stacked up like the walls of a very serious child's fort. No nails in the structure. The joints are cut so tightly that they hold by geometry and weight alone, and the gaps between the logs are stuffed with moss, which swells when it is damp and seals the wall against the wind. The roof is planks or thatch, steeply pitched, so the snow slides off before its weight can break the beams. The windows are small and set high, because a window is a hole in your insulation, and you want as few of them as possible. In poorer houses, the glass is not glass. It is a sheet of mica, or a stretched and oiled bladder, and it lets through a dull amber suggestion of daylight, and nothing more. And then, occupying somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the entire floor space of your home, there is the stove. The Russian stove is not really a stove in the way you are picturing. It is a monument. It is a solid mass of brick and clay, often as big as a small car, built up from the floor with a great arched mouth in the front and a chimney running up through the roof. You light a fire inside it in the morning. The fire heats the mass. The mass holds that heat and releases it slowly for the next 12 hours or more, so that the stove is still gently warm when the fire has been dead since noon. You bake bread in it. You cook soup in it, in clay pots pushed into the hot mouth on a long forked stick so that the food does not boil so much as sit and slowly transform. You dry mushrooms and berries and grain on it. You dry your soaked felt boots on it. When someone is ill, you put them on it. And at night, you sleep on it, and around it, and above it. There is a wooden shelf built high across the room, up in the warm air near the ceiling, called the palati. That is where the children go, and the old people, because heat rises, and those are the two groups least able to generate their own. The rest of the family arranges itself on benches along the walls, on the broad ledge running along the side of the stove, and on the floor. Nobody has a bedroom. Almost nobody has a bed. The concept of a private sleeping space for one person would strike your household as not merely unaffordable, but genuinely strange, like heating a room nobody is in, because your household is not four people. A serf household is commonly 10, 12, sometimes 20. It is a married couple, their grown sons, the sons' wives, all of the grandchildren, an unmarried aunt, a widowed grandmother. 3 generations under one roof and one stove in a space smaller than a modern two-car garage. This is not sentimentality about family. It is arithmetic. Your obligations to your landlord are assessed on the household as a unit, and a household needs a certain number of working hands to meet them and survive a bad year. Split the household in two, and you get 2 weak households where you had one strong one. So the family stays welded together, and the man at the head of it, the bolshak, has real authority over adults who in another society would long since have set up on their own. Now look at the far corner of the room, diagonally opposite the stove. It is the corner that faces roughly east, and it is called the beautiful corner or the red corner. In Old Russian, the two words are the same, which tells you something all by itself. There is a shelf there, and on it are the icons, painted saints on wood, dark with candle smoke, sometimes crudely done by a village painter, sometimes surprisingly beautiful. There will be a small lamp burning in front of them on feast days. A guest coming into your house crosses himself toward that corner before he greets anyone in it. The most honored person at a meal sits beneath it. When somebody in the house is dying, they are moved so that they can see it. So the whole room has 2 poles: the stove, which is heat and food and survival and the body, and the corner, which is heaven and the dead and the promise that this is not all there is. Everything else in your life happens on the floor between them. What else is in the room? Less than you think. A table, scrubbed pale, benches fixed to the walls, a cradle hanging from a flexible pole in the ceiling beam so that it can be rocked with one foot while both hands keep working, hooks and pegs, a chest, if the family is doing well, holding the good clothes and the linen a daughter is assembling for her marriage, and the whole house smells permanently of wood smoke and rye bread and damp sheepskin and the animals, because in the very worst of the winter, some of the animals are in here with you: the lambs, the calf, the chickens under the bench. They are too valuable to lose to the cold, and your body heat and theirs are at that point a shared resource. There is one more thing to say about the izba, and it is the thing that hangs over the whole village every summer. It is made of wood. It is stuffed with moss. It has an open fire in the middle of it, and it is one of 40 such houses standing shoulder to shoulder along a single street. Villages burned, not rarely, routinely, a fact of life, the way we think about a hard frost. One overturned candle in July, and a wind out of the east, and a whole community loses everything it has by nightfall. And then they rebuild it, because everyone knows how, because the trees are right there, and because the design has not needed to change in 3 centuries. Your food is monotonous in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to imagine, and it is also, on a good day, extremely good. Both of those are true, and the difference between them is the difference between a full granary and an empty one. The foundation of everything is rye, not wheat. Wheat is a southern crop, a luxury, a thing you might see at a wedding or in a landowner's kitchen. Rye grows where the summer is short and the soil is thin and the frost comes early, which describes most of the country you live in. So you eat black bread, dense, sour, dark as wet earth, baked in the mouth of the stove in enormous round loaves that a woman shovels in on a long wooden peel. A loaf like that keeps for a week. It is cut against the chest with a knife pulled toward you, and the first slice is treated with a seriousness that is difficult to overstate. Bread is not a component of the meal. Bread is the meal. Everything else is there to make the bread go down. Alongside it, in the pot, is shchichi, cabbage soup. It is the single most Russian thing on the table, and it is on the table almost every day of your life. Cabbage, water, whatever fat you have, an onion, and in a good household, a piece of meat that flavors it far more than it feeds anyone. The genius of shchasi is the cabbage itself, which is salted and fermented in barrels in the autumn in quantities that would alarm you. A household might put down enough sour cabbage to last until spring. Fermented, it keeps for months without a cellar cold enough for anything else, and, although nobody in your village has heard the word, it holds its vitamin C, which is the quiet reason your family does not fall apart with scurvy every February. Then there is kasha, boiled grain, buckwheat most often, sometimes millet or barley, cooked in the slow, steady heat of the stove until it swells and softens. There is another proverb for this one, shchi and kasha, that's our food. It is said the way you might say bread and butter, meaning the ordinary, the reliable, the thing that does not need discussing. To drink, kvass. It is made by pouring water over stale black bread, letting it ferment for a couple of days, and straining it. It is faintly alcoholic, sour, slightly sweet, and it is what everyone drinks all day, children included, because it is safer than standing water, and because it has enough sugar in it to be worth something on a working morning. Around this core, everything else is seasonal and gathered rather than grown. Mushrooms, which you pick by the basket in the damp weeks of late summer and dry in strings above the stove. Berries, bilberries, lingonberries, wild strawberries. Turnips, which were the great filling root vegetable of Russian life long before the potato arrived, and caused riots when the government tried to force it on villages that had never seen one and did not trust it. Meat is rare, not absent. You keep chickens. You might kill a pig at the start of winter. There might be a sheep. But an animal alive is a working asset, and an animal dead is one enormous meal, and then nothing. So meat clusters around feasts and slaughtering season, and the rest of the year it appears as flavor rather than substance. And then there is the church, which shapes what is in the pot more thoroughly than any landlord ever did. Orthodox fasting is not a token gesture. It is roughly 200 days a year on which no meat, no dairy, no eggs are permitted. Wednesdays and Fridays every week. Great Lent for 7 weeks before Easter. The Apostles' Fast, the Dormition Fast, the Nativity Fast in the dark of December. But then comes the other side of it, because a fasting calendar implies a feasting calendar, and the feasts were real. Easter, which in Russia is the great one, larger than Christmas, is the end of 7 weeks of hunger. There is a rich cylindrical bread called kulich, and a sweetened curd cheese pyramid called pascha, and eggs dyed red and cracked against each other in a game everyone plays. There is meat, there is drink. After midnight service in a church lit entirely by candles, in a village that has eaten cabbage since February, that first mouthful is not a meal, it is an event. And Maslenitsa, the wild butter week before Lent begins, when the rule is to eat everything perishable in the house before the fast locks it away. That is pancakes, blini, round and golden and endless, eaten with butter and sour cream and whatever else is left for a solid week, with sledging and fistfights and a straw effigy burned at the end of it. So the rhythm is not simply deprivation. It is a long, low hum of sameness, punctuated by days of real abundance that everybody has spent weeks anticipating. Now the hard part, and I will not dress it up. Grain harvests fail, not occasionally, regularly. A late frost, a wet August, a summer of drought, and the yield falls below what the village needs to feed itself and meet its dues and hold back next year's seed. And when that happens, the bread changes. The old accounts describe it plainly. Flour cut with ground bark, with chaff, with pigweed, with acorns. The bread comes out heavy and bitter, and it does not nourish, but it fills, and filling is what you are after. Villages went hungry in a way that shows up in the parish registers as spikes in the number of burials, and in the diaries of travelers as a bewildered note about how thin everyone in one particular district looked that year. It was not constant. Some decades were kind, and there are plenty of accounts of well-fed, sturdy, cheerful villages. But it was always possible, and everyone in the household knew it, and it is the reason the granary and the salted barrels and the strings of dried mushrooms were treated with something close to reverence. You were never more than one bad summer away from the bark bread. Your year does not have 12 months in it. It has about 5, and then it has a long white pause. This is the fact that shapes Russian rural life more than any law ever passed. In a French or English village, the farming year is long and gentle, and something can be done outdoors in almost every month. Where you live, the growing season is roughly 120 days, and everything that must happen in a year has to be crammed into that window at a pace that borders on frantic. So let us walk the year, and you will feel how it moves. It begins in mud. The Russian word for it is rasputitsa, and it means, roughly, the unroading, the season when roads cease to be roads. The snow that has been lying since November melts all at once into ground that is still frozen underneath, so the water has nowhere to go. The result is not a wet track. It is a river of liquid clay, sometimes hub deep, that swallows carts and pulls the boots off horses. For several weeks in spring, and again for several weeks in autumn, large parts of the empire simply stop. No wagons move. Post is delayed. Landowners cannot travel to their estates, and officials cannot travel anywhere. If you need to reach the next village during the Rasputitsa, you walk, and you accept what will happen to you. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains a great deal. Twice a year, for a total of perhaps 2 months, your village becomes effectively unreachable. Whatever authority exists over you is for those weeks a rumor on the far side of a bog. Then the ground dries and everything happens at once. Sewing by hand, broadcast from a basket at the hip, a motion so old and so specific that painters have been reproducing it for 1,000 years. Your land is not one field. It is a scatter of narrow strips, perhaps 30 of them, spread across three great open fields, with your neighbor's strips on either side of each one. This looks insane, and it is not. It is deliberate risk management. If hail flattens one corner of the parish, it does not flatten all of your holding, only a fraction of it. The cost is that you walk miles in a working day, and you cannot make a single decision about your own land without coordinating with everyone whose strips touch yours. Then haymaking in late June and the early July, and this is the moment the whole village goes out together. Haymaking is the hinge on which the winter turns. If you cut and dry enough hay, your animals live until spring. If you do not, you slaughter them in the autumn or watch them starve in February. And hay must be cut in a dry spell, and dried in a dry spell, and got under cover before the rain. So when the weather is right, everybody goes, women and children and the old, and they work from before dawn until it is too dark to see the scythe. There are songs for it. There is a whole literature of them. And there are accounts from observers who could not quite process what they were watching. Entire villages moving across a meadow in a line, singing in a burst of collective effort that nothing in their own society resembled. Then harvest, which is the same but worse, because the grain is the year, and the weather in August can turn in an afternoon. Reaping with a sickle, not a scythe, a sickle, bent double hour after hour, mostly the work of women. Binding, stooking, carding, threshing on a barn floor with flails. And then, quite suddenly, it is over. The autumn Rasputitsa comes down, and the world turns to mud again. And then the mud freezes, and then the snow comes and stays for 5 months. Now everyone imagines winter as the dead time. It is not. It is simply a different economy. For one thing, winter is when travel gets easy. This is the great reversal of Russian geography. Frozen rivers and packed snow make superb roads. A sledge glides over ground that a cart could not cross in June. Goods that cannot move in summer move hundreds of miles in January. Trade fairs, pilgrimages, visits, weddings. The sociable half of the year is the frozen half, because that is when you can actually get anywhere. For another, winter is when the household makes things. Every hour of darkness that can be lit by a splinter of burning birch is filled with work. The women spin flax and wool, weave linen on a loom set up in the corner, embroiderers sew. The men make and mend sledges, harness, barrels, wooden bowls, felt boots, bast shoes, woven out of strips of lime bark, of which a working man might get through several pairs in a season. In whole districts, this winter work stopped being domestic and became an industry. Villages specialized. One made icons, another made samovars, another made toys, another wove cotton, another tanned leather. This cottage manufacturing had a name, Kustar Industry, and by the 19th century it was employing millions of people and supplying a serious share of the empire's manufactured goods, which is the first crack in the picture of the serf as a man who only pushed a plow. A very large number of them spent half the year as artisans, and a meaningful number of them got good enough at it to change their families' fortunes entirely. We will come back to those men. But underneath all of it, all year, is the calculation everybody in the household is doing without ever speaking it aloud. There is only so much daylight. There is only so much labor in the family. And a portion of both, a large, fixed, non negotiable portion, does not belong to you. Here is the part that stops people short when they first hear it, and it is completely true. Nobody in the manor house decided who farmed which field in your village. You did. You and every other head of household standing in the road arguing about it. The institution is called the mir, or the obshchina, and the word mir is one of those beautiful accidents of language. In Russian, it means the village community, and it also means the world, and it also means peace. For most people in your village, all three of those meanings pointed at the same 40 houses. The mir was the village assembly, and it met in the open. Not in a hall, there was no hall. In the street, no, or in front of the church, or in somebody's yard. Every household sent its head, which in practice meant the older men, though widows heading households attended and were heard, and there are records of them arguing forcefully and winning. And what did it decide? Very nearly everything. It decided how the land was divided. In much of the country, the arable was not permanently owned by any family. It was held by the community and periodically redistributed so that a household with 4 working sons received more strips and a household reduced to a widow and a child received fewer. Every so often, the whole village would remeasure and reallocate the entire parish. Land followed need and capacity, not inheritance. It decided when to plow and when to sow and when to turn the cattle onto the stubble, because with everyone's strips interleaved in the same open fields, those decisions could not be made individually. One man cannot harvest in September if his neighbors are grazing sheep across the same field in August. It settled disputes. A boundary stone moved, a straying pig, a broken promise over a horse, an accusation of theft, and it settled them by its own standards, not by the law of the empire, which most people in the village could not read and had never seen, but by custom, precedent, and a rough practical sense of what would let these 40 families keep living next to each other. It handled the poor. A household burned out by fire had its house rebuilt by collective labor. Orphans were placed. An old couple with no sons had their strips worked for them by neighbors in exchange for the land coming back to the community afterwards, and it collected the taxes, and this is where the mir stops being purely benign. The empire did not tax individuals, it taxed the community as a body for the total sum owed by everyone in it. The village was jointly liable. If your neighbor could not pay, the shortfall did not vanish, It landed on everybody else. The Russian term for this is Krugovaya Poruka, mutual guarantee, and it is the mechanism that made the whole system work, and also the mechanism that made it inescapable, because it meant the village had a fierce collective interest in everybody pulling their weight. A lazy household was not a private tragedy, it was a bill. A drunkard was not merely a sad case, he was a levy on his neighbors. And so the Mir policed its own members, hard, with a moral pressure that could be more constant and more inescapable than anything a distant landowner ever applied. And it meant that the Mir had to decide who was expendable. That is the darkest power the assembly held, and we will come to it properly when we talk about the army. But it hangs over everything. When the state demanded men, the village chose which men. When somebody had to be sent away, the village chose. Your neighbors held a genuine functioning democracy, and one of the things they voted on was you. At the head of it all stood the starosta, the elder. He was often chosen by the assembly, sometimes appointed by the landlord, and confirmed by the assembly, and he sat in an awkward, exhausting position between the two. He had to deliver what the estate demanded, and he had to go on living in a village of people who would remember for the rest of his life how he had behaved. Now, how much did the landlord actually interfere in all this? Less than you would think, and the reason is boring and practical. Most nobles did not live on their estates. They lived in Moscow or Petersburg, or they were away with a regiment, and they visited perhaps once a year or not at all. An estate ran on paperwork, and a hired steward, and a steward supervising 400 souls across several villages does not have the capacity to micromanage the sowing. What the estate wanted was the dues, delivered on time. How the village arranged itself in order to produce them was, very largely, the village's own business. The landlord set the total. The Mir decided who carried it. And that arrangement created a genuine functioning tradition of self-government among people who had no political rights whatsoever. Millions of legally unfree men spent their entire lives voting, debating, holding office, and administering a small commonwealth while being, on paper, property. I want to be careful here because this is exactly where accounts of serfdom go wrong in the other direction. The Mir was not freedom. It could be conservative, suffocating, and cruel to anyone who did not fit. The woman with an unwanted reputation, the man who wanted to farm differently, the family with an old grievance against it. It bound you to the collective as tightly as the law bound you to the estate. Later reformers trying to modernize Russian agriculture would come to see the commune as the single greatest obstacle in their way. But it was a school. It taught argument, procedure, negotiation, the counting of votes, the management of a common purse. And when emancipation finally came and the state needed some structure to hand the land to, it did not have to invent one. It was already there, standing in the road, arguing about who got which strip. Everything about the texture of your life, how hard it is, how free you feel, whether you will ever see a city, comes down to a single administrative decision that was made before you were born by a man you have probably never met. Does your estate take labor or does it take money? Those are the two systems. In Russian, they are barshchina and obrok, and the difference between them is enormous. Barshchina is labor dues. The estate has its own land, the domain farmed for the landlord's profit, and you are the workforce. The conventional figure is 3 days a week, 3 days on the Lord's fields, 3 days on your own, and Sunday for church and rest. Read that again, because the arithmetic is savage. You are not working 3 days out of 7 for yourself. You are working 3 days out of 6, which is half of all the labor your household can produce, given away before you have fed a single child. And it is worse than a clean 50% split for a reason that has nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with weather. The best days to bring in hay are the same for everyone. The 3 dry days in July, when the grass must be cut, are the same 3 days on the Lord's meadow and on yours. And when the demands collide, the estate goes first. So the Lord's hay comes in dry, and yours comes in after the rain, and the Lord's grain is reaped at the perfect moment, and yours stands a week too long and sheds seed onto the ground. The 3 days were also a convention rather than a law, and conventions bend. On badly run estates, the demand crept to 4 days, to 5. Emperor Paul issued a manifesto in 1797 suggesting 3 days as the proper limit and forbidding Sunday work, and the word suggesting is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, because it was phrased as a recommendation and enforced almost nowhere. Now the other system, Obrok, is quitrent, a fixed payment in cash or in kind, owed by the household every year. Deliver it, and how you spend the rest of your time is very largely your own affair. You can see immediately why this changes everything. Under Obrok, your labor belongs to you. If you can earn the payment faster by doing something other than farming, nobody particularly minds how. And so Obrok serfs did exactly that. They carted goods, they traded, they took their winter crafts and turned them into businesses. They left the village entirely for months at a time and went to work in the cities and came back with cash, which meant a whole legal apparatus had to exist to let them go. A serf leaving the estate needed a written passport from his landlord, valid for a set period, and the estate charged for it. That document is one of the strangest objects in the whole system. A piece of paper that says, in effect, this man is owned, and he is permitted to travel 300 miles away and live among strangers and make money, provided he comes back. By the middle of the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of men were doing this every year. They were the labor force that built the cities. The cab drivers of Petersburg, the carpenters, the porters, the waiters in restaurants, whole guilds of tradesmen, enormous numbers of them, were legally somebody's property in a village 4 provinces away, sending payments home. So which system you lived under was close to a lottery, and it followed geography with real logic. In the Black Earth South, where the soil is so rich it is almost obscene, and grain grows abundantly, land was worth farming, and labor was worth extracting, so those estates ran on barshchina. In the poor, sandy north, where an estate could not make a fortune from grain, no matter how many bodies it threw at the fields, landowners worked out that it was more profitable to let their serfs go and earn money elsewhere and hand over a share. So the North ran heavily on Obrok, which produces one of the great ironies of Russian history. The peasants living on the best land in the empire were on the whole the least free in practice, and the peasants scratching a living out of thin northern soil were the ones with passports in their pockets and city wages in their hands. Most estates ran a mixture, and the mix could change when a new owner inherited, or when a steward decided the numbers looked better the other way. A village could go to sleep under Obrok and be told at Easter that it was Barshchina now, and a family's entire way of living would be rearranged by a line in a ledger. And then there were the dues nobody wrote down: eggs at Easter, a goose at Christmas, mushrooms and berries delivered to the manor kitchen, linen woven by the women of the household and handed over by the yard, cartage, your horse and your time, moving the estate's goods to market for as long as it takes, building work when the manor wanted a new barn, firewood, cut and split and stacked. None of these were large individually. All of them together were a constant low level drain on a household that had no slack in it anywhere. Underneath all of this sits a fact that is easy to lose. Your household is not poor because it is unproductive. It is producing a great deal. A significant portion of that production is leaving. And that is what a serf economy actually is, stripped of everything else. It is a machine for moving the surplus of several million households upward, converting it into a great house with a colonnade, a French tutor for the children, a season in the capital, a box at the opera, a debt at the card table. At the edge of the village, usually on the only rise in the landscape, usually behind a screen of lime trees planted for the purpose, is the other house. It is painted. That alone marks it out. Yellow ochre, most often, with white columns across the front, because the fashion of the age was for the Russian countryside to look faintly like an Athenian temple that had wandered several thousand miles north and got lost. Inside there is a piano, and French novels, and portraits, and wallpaper brought from Moscow, and a library that in the better houses is genuinely good and in the worse houses has never been opened. And there is a staff, and the staff are people like you who happened to be born on the other end of a decision. These are the Dvorovi, the household serfs. They are perhaps 5 or 6% of all serfs in the empire, which sounds small until you remember the total, and then it is over 1 million human beings. They do everything a great house requires: cooks and undercooks, coachmen and grooms and stable boys, laundresses, seamstresses, nursemaids and wet nurses, gardeners, carpenters, musicians, footmen in livery who spend the entire evening standing perfectly still behind chairs, girls of 11 whose only job is to sit in an anteroom in case a bell rings. And here is the thing that surprises people. This was not always the better life. Very often, it was worse. The field serf is poor and exhausted, but he has a house, a strip of land, a cow, a place in the assembly, and a village that will rebuild his roof if it burns. The household serf has none of that. He has no land. He owns nothing that generates anything. He is fed and clothed by the estate, and he is entirely, absolutely dependent on it and on the temper of the people inside it. He is also permanently visible. The field serf is watched by a steward at a distance. The household serf lives inside the surveillance, 3 rooms from the master, on call at every hour, judged constantly on whether the tea was hot, and the boots were polished, and the door was opened before the guest had to reach for it. And when a household serf falls out of favor, he has nowhere to fall back to. He can be sent to the fields, and a man who has been a valet since he was 9 has no idea how to plow, and the village he is dumped into does not know him and does not want him. Now, the other side. Household service was also the route to almost everything interesting a serf could do. If you were quick as a child, you might be taught to read so you could be useful in the office. If you had a voice, you might be sent for training. Estates ran their own choirs and their own orchestras, and boys with talent were taken and taught properly, sometimes by imported foreign masters. Serf architects designed the houses. Serf painters produced the portraits on the walls. There were serf doctors, trained at the owner's expense, and serf pharmacists, and serf accountants who ran estates worth fortunes and understood the finances better than the man who owned them. The pattern repeats so often it stops being remarkable. An owner spots ability in a child in his own village, invests in it for reasons of vanity or genuine interest or both, and creates a person of real education and accomplishment who is still legally an item on an inventory. Some of those people were freed, sir, many were not. There are letters, a serf painter writing carefully in beautiful script to ask his owner whether the promise of manumission discussed some years ago might now be considered. Letters like that survive in estate archives, filed with the accounts. And then there is the question everyone circles, so let us say it plainly and then move on. Young women taken into the household were vulnerable in a way that had no remedy at all. There was no authority to appeal to, because the authority was the household. This happened, it is documented, and the people it happened to left almost no record of their own, because they were not the sort of people whose accounts got written down. It is the part of the system with the least excuse and the least evidence, and it deserves to be named rather than described. Now let me tell you about a man called Nikolai, and about a house he built, because it complicates everything. Count Nikolai Sheremetyev was one of the richest men in the empire. His family owned somewhere around 200,000 serfs, which is not a household, it is a population the size of a city. And he was obsessed with theater. His estate at Kuskovo, outside Moscow, had a theater that seated hundreds, with machinery for scene changes that visiting Europeans described as better than what they had at home. He built a second, more magnificent one at Ostankino. He ran a company of some 200 performers, and every single one of them was his property. They were trained by professionals. They were taught French and Italian, singing, dancing, deportment. They performed opera, real opera, contemporary repertoire, in front of the audiences that included the Empress. The company had a leading soprano. Her name was Praskovia Kovalyova. Her father was a blacksmith on the estate, a man with a drinking problem, and she was taken into the house as a child of about 8 because someone noticed she could sing. She was given a stage name in the way all his performers were. They were renamed after gemstones, the whole company, so there was a garnet and a turquoise and an emerald. Praskovia became Zhemchugova, from the Russian word for pearl. By her 20s, she was, by every surviving account, one of the finest singers in Russia. Foreign visitors wrote home about her. The Empress gave her a ring, and she was owned by the man who was standing in the wings watching her. We will come back to Praskovia. Her story goes somewhere nobody expected, and it ends in a way that is either the most romantic thing in this entire script or the saddest, and I have never been able to decide which. A serf wedding lasts several days, involves the entire village, and begins with the bride crying, not out of nerves, out of obligation. There is a whole genre of ritual lament performed by the bride and the women around her in the days before the ceremony, in which she mourns her girlhood, says goodbye to her own household, and grieves the loss of the life she is leaving. There were women in every district known for being good at it, who could be called in to lead the wailing. And then, when the laments are finished, the wedding itself is enormous and loud and joyful, with singing and drinking and a procession and a great deal of ritual involving bread and salt and grain thrown over the couple for fertility. Both halves are sincere. That is the thing to understand about it. The grief is real, and the celebration is real, and nobody in the village finds it contradictory to do one on Tuesday and the other on Thursday. The grief is real because of what marriage actually means for a young woman in this world. She does not leave to start a new household, she leaves to enter someone else's. She moves into her husband's father's house, joining his mother and his brothers and his brothers' wives, and she arrives at the bottom of the entire hierarchy, younger than the other wives, unrelated by blood to anyone, and evaluated daily on how much work she can do. Her name in that house is a specific word, Snoka, the daughter-in-law, and folklore is thick with songs about how hard those first years are. The mother-in-law is the ruling power in the domestic sphere, and she has been waiting her whole life for someone to be at the bottom of it instead of her. The one thing the young wife brings that is entirely her own is her dowry chest, linen she has woven and embroidered herself, sometimes from the age of 7 or 8. It is not a formality. In a house where everything is collective, that chest is the only property she has, and she keeps the key. Now, who chose the match? Mostly the two sets of parents, negotiating with a matchmaker, weighing the things that actually mattered. Is that family hardworking? Do they have land and a horse? Is the girl strong? Is the boy a drinker? Is there a feud? Affection was considered a pleasant possibility rather than a basis for a decision. But the landlord's shadow lies across it too, and how heavily depended entirely on the estate. Legally, a serf needed permission to marry, and permission could be refused. Some estates charged a fee for it. Marrying someone from a different owner's village was a serious complication because the woman would move away and take her future children, and children were the estate's future workforce, so it often required an arrangement between two landowners, or a payment, or an exchange. And on badly run estates, it got much uglier. There are documented cases of owners simply pairing off young people by decree to produce households and therefore taxpayers and therefore revenue, matching names on a list without a word to either party. This was not universal. On many estates, the village arranged its own marriages and the office rubber stamped them. But the possibility existed everywhere, and it is the point at which the ownership stops being economic and becomes something else. Then come the children, and here we have to slow down, because this is the hardest arithmetic in the whole script. A serf woman might bear 7, 8, 10 children over her fertile years. A great many of those children did not live to their fifth birthday. Infant mortality in the Russian countryside ran, in bad districts and bad decades, close to 1 in 3 in the first year alone. The causes were the ordinary ones: infectious disease in a crowded room, contaminated water, diarrhea in the summer heat, and the treatment was whatever the village knew, which was herbs and prayer and a healer with a reputation, because a doctor was a thing that existed in a town 2 days away and cost money you did not have. And the fields were the reason. A woman was back at work astonishingly quickly after giving birth, because in July there is no version of the household economy that can spare her, and there was no arrangement anywhere that made room for her recovery. I want to say something about how families carried this, because it is easy to reach for the wrong conclusion. People sometimes assume that where child death is common, it must hurt less. The evidence says otherwise. The laments say otherwise. There is an entire tradition of funeral wailing for children, some of it recorded by folklorists in the 19th century, and it is unbearable to read. The little cross in the churchyard, the name given to the next child, the memorial days when families went out to the graves with food and sat there for the afternoon. They grieved exactly as much. They simply had to grieve while also getting the hay in. The children who lived joined the workforce early. At 5 or 6, a child watches the geese and minds the smaller children. At 8, a girl is spinning and a boy is leading the horse at the plow. By 12, they are doing something close to adult work, and by 15, they are adults in everything but the ceremony. There was no schooling to speak of for most of them. Literacy among serfs was low, in some surveys, well under 1 in 10, and much lower for women, and the education that existed came from the church, or from a soldier who had come home able to read, or from a village elder teaching letters out of a prayer book. But there was another kind of education, and it was not trivial. Everything the household knew was transmitted by voice: which mushrooms are safe, how to read the sky in June, every song for every stage of the year, the genealogy of the whole village, going back 4 generations, held in the memory of the oldest woman in the house. That is what family lore actually was, before anyone had the leisure to write it down. It was a survival technology, passed from a grandmother on the sleeping shelf to a child lying beside her in the warm dark above the stove, in a house where the fire had gone down to embers, and there was nothing to do until morning but talk. Which, as it happens, is more or less what we are doing right now. If you are still awake, and if any of that stirred something, a grandmother, a story, a name nobody in your family can quite place anymore, that is exactly what I would love to hear about in the comments. The oldest thing your family still repeats. It does not have to be dramatic. Some of the best ones are 3 sentences about a stubborn great aunt. And if you have drifted off already, that is entirely the point, and I will keep going quietly for the rest of us. There is a ritual in the Russian countryside that visitors could not make sense of when they first encountered it. A young man is standing in the middle of his own house. His mother is keening over him. The lament being sung is the lament for the dead. The same words, the same rise and fall, the one you would perform over a body. Neighbors come and sit with the family as they would sit at a wake. There is food and drink, and everyone weeps, and everyone treats this healthy 20-year-old man as though he has already been carried out. He has just been chosen for the army. The recruit levy, the recrucina, was introduced by Peter the Great at the very beginning of the 18th century, and it was the single most feared thing in a serf's life. Not hunger, not flogging, this. Because for most of its existence, military service was 25 years. 25 years. If you are taken at 20, you come home at 45, in a world where a great many people did not reach 45. Your parents will be dead. Your brothers will have children you have never met. Your betrothed will have married someone else 15 years ago, and nobody will blame her because everyone understood what being taken meant. So the village buried you. It was not superstition, and it was not confusion. It was accurate. Statistically and practically, the man leaving in the cart was not coming back, and the ritual acknowledged what everyone in the room already knew. Now, here is the part that makes the whole thing so much heavier. The state did not choose the men. The state told each community how many recruits it owed, so many per thousand souls, adjusted upward in wartime, and then left the selection to the village, to the mirror, to the assembly in the street, to your neighbors. So imagine that meeting. The demand has come down, 2 men this autumn. Every household head in the village is standing outside in the cold with the same arithmetic running behind his eyes, which is that if it is not my son, it is somebody's son. And then they decide, using criteria that were rough, practical, brutal, and, in their own terms, genuinely moral. Households with several grown sons went first, because a family with 4 working men could lose one and survive, and a widow with 1 son could not. That was the great principle, and it was applied consistently enough to show up clearly in the records. But other things went into it. The village disposed of its problems. The persistent drunk, the thief everyone suspected, but nobody could prove, the young man who had got a girl into trouble and refused to marry her, the family that had made itself unpopular over 2 generations and had no allies left in the assembly. And money went into it. Of course it did. A rich household could buy a substitute, pay another family, or a landless man, or a stranger, to go in their son's place. There was an open market in recruit substitutes with going rates that everybody knew, and it meant that in practice, the levy fell hardest on the poor, as levies always do. The landlord had a hand in it too. He could nominate, and a landowner who wanted to be rid of a difficult serf, one who argued, one who had complained to an official, one who had become inconvenient, had, in the recruit levy, an entirely legal instrument for removing a man from his estate for a quarter of a century. That was understood by everyone. It was the unspoken sentence at the end of many arguments. Once chosen, the recruit's head was shaved at the front in the distinctive style that marked him instantly, everywhere, as a soldier. He was taken to a collection point, examined, measured against the minimum height, and marched away in a party under guard because men ran. And then a strange thing happened to him, legally speaking. He stopped being a serf. The moment he entered the army, he passed out of his landowner's ownership entirely. He belonged to the state now, and if he survived his 25 years, he came home free, not to his old village as property, but as a retired soldier, a legally distinct category of person who could not be owned by anybody. So the recruit levy was, among all the other things it was, the largest emancipation machine in the empire. It processed millions of men, and it gave freedom to the ones it did not kill. The rate at which it killed them is the thing. Most soldiers who died in the Russian army of this period did not die in battle. They died of disease, in barracks, and on the march. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, in numbers that in peacetime years were still appalling. Add in the campaigns, which were constant, and the arithmetic of survival across 25 years is not encouraging. The term did come down eventually to 15 years in the 1830s and shorter again later with a period of reserve. But by then the ritual and the terror were 3 or 4 generations old and did not soften at anything like the same rate. And some men did come home. They came back to villages they no longer had a place in, with a small pension if they were lucky, and a store of stories, and, very often, the ability to read, which the army had taught them and the village had not. Old soldiers turn up constantly in 19th century Russian writing as a stock figure, sitting on a bench in the sun, teaching children their letters, telling enormous stories about Paris, half of which were true, because a Russian peasant conscript really had marched into Paris in 1814 and seen it with his own eyes. Think about that man for a moment, taken from a village of 40 wooden houses, where the furthest anyone had gone was the market town, marched 2,000 miles across Europe, stood in a foreign capital as part of a victorious army, and then walked home to a village where he was legally free and utterly out of place, and sat down on a bench and tried to explain to people who had never left the parish what a boulevard was. Every autumn in the northern provinces, after the grain was in and before the roads froze hard, men began walking out of the villages. They went in groups, often the same group every year, with a bundle and a pair of spare bast shoes and a document folded into an inner pocket that mattered more than anything else they carried. The practice is called odchodnichestvo, and the word means roughly going away. And it involved, by the middle of the 19th century, something on the order of 1 million people a year. Here is how it worked. If you were an Obrok serf, your obligation was a fixed annual sum. Your village, on thin northern soil, could not produce that sum from grain, but a carpenter in Petersburg could earn it in 4 months. So the estate office issued you a passport, a written permission to be absent for a stated period, usually a year, renewable. You paid for it. And with that paper in your coat, you were legally entitled to travel hundreds of miles from the place you were owned, live among strangers, take wages, and keep whatever was left after your dues went home. Without that paper, you were a runaway, and any official who stopped you could send you back under escort. So picture the man himself. He is legally property. He is, at this moment, walking down a street in the imperial capital, past palaces, past carriages, past officers in uniform. He is going to a hiring corner where men from his own province gather, because these networks ran on village connections and always had. And what did they do when they got there? Nearly everything. They built the city, the scaffolding trades, the stonemasons' gangs, the plasterers, the roofers, overwhelmingly seasonal men from serf villages. Petersburg is a city of imperial architecture, erected substantially by people who did not legally own themselves. They drove the cabs. The Petersburg cabman was such a specific type from particular districts with particular speech that novelists could place his home province from a line of dialogue. They carried things: porters, dock labor, warehousemen, the men who moved firewood and water and everything else a pre industrial city consumes in vast quantity. And they made things. Whole industries were staffed by them: the early textile mills, ironworks, the metal trades. When Russian industrialization began in earnest, its workforce was not a landless proletariat, because Russia did not have one. It was serfs and former serfs with a passport in their pocket and a strip of land 400 miles away that they went home to plant in the spring. Now, what did this do to a village? It changed it in ways that show up in the records, like weather. Money came in, cash, real coin, in a rural economy that mostly ran on barter and grain. Villages with a strong migration tradition were visibly richer: better houses, better roofs, more livestock, iron tools instead of wooden ones, and eventually samovars and printed cotton and boots instead of bark shoes. Information came in. A man who has spent 4 months in Petersburg comes home knowing things. He has seen printed newspapers being read aloud. He has heard what wages are elsewhere, and what other estates charge for obrok, and what the law actually says about something his steward told him was impossible. That kind of knowledge is corrosive to a system that depends on nobody being able to compare. And absence came in, which is the other half of it. For a large part of the year, a great many villages were populated by women, children, and old men. The wives ran the households and the farms and did the field work and made the decisions, and the returning husband each spring arrived into a household that had been managed perfectly well without him. Some of them did not come back at all. The passport lapses, the man stays, the letters get further apart, and eventually the estate writes off a soul it will never see again. Runaway lists were long, and they got longer as the cities got bigger. There is a specific melancholy in the folk songs about this, and it belongs to the women. The husband gone since October, the child who does not recognize his father, the village where the young men are all away, and the harvest is being brought in by the wrong hands. But here is the point I want to leave you with, because it undoes the picture most people carry. If your image of a Russian serf is a man permanently bent over a furrow, who never in his life went further than the parish boundary, for millions of them, that is simply wrong. They walked to Moscow, they wintered in Petersburg, they traded down the Volga, carted goods to fairs 1,000 miles away, worked in mills, kept shops, ran their own small enterprises, and came home in the spring with money and news and a wider sense of the world than most of the gentry could have guessed. They were bound. Their bond was real, and it was enforced, and their earnings were taxed at the far end by a man they had never met. But they were not still. They moved constantly, in enormous numbers, up and down an empire that ran, in a very real sense, on their walking. And a few of them, walking those roads, saw an opportunity that nobody in the manor house had noticed at all. In a village in the Vladimir province, on land belonging to the Sheremet family, Something happened in the 18th century that the system was never designed to handle. The village was called Ivanovo, and it wove cloth. It started as ordinary winter work, linen woven at home, sold at fairs. Then some households got better at it than others. Then those households started buying yarn in bulk and putting it out to their neighbors to weave, and collecting the finished cloth and selling it in quantity. Then they started printing patterns on it, which was where the money was. Then they built sheds. Then the sheds became workshops. Then the workshops became mills. And by the beginning of the 19th century, Ivanovo was one of the great textile centers of the Russian Empire, producing cotton on a scale that mattered to the national economy, and the men running it were every last one of them the legal property of the Sheremetevs. Let me be precise about what that means, because it is genuinely strange. A man in Ivanovo owns a factory. He employs several hundred workers. He has capital in the tens of thousands of rubles, contracts with merchants in Moscow, a house that is better than most of the gentry's, and a business that would be respectable in Manchester. He cannot own the ground the factory stands on. He cannot leave without a passport. He can, in principle, be recalled to the village and set to work in a field, and there is no court in the empire that would stop it. And this is the part people refuse to believe the first time they hear it. He can own serfs himself, not legally in his own name, since a serf could not hold that kind of property outright. In his master's name, held on his behalf, an arrangement everybody understood and nobody wrote down honestly. Men who were property held property that was people. Why did the Sheremetevs allow it? Because it was the most profitable thing they had ever stumbled into. An obrok payment scales with what the payer can earn. A serf farming rye owes you a few rubles a year. A serf running a textile mill can be assessed at thousands, and he will pay it, and he will keep expanding, and his obrok will keep rising. The estate did not need to invest a kopeck. It simply sat at the end of the pipe. So the great families protected their industrial serfs, encouraged them, lent them money, and blocked them from doing the one thing they wanted more than anything in the world, which was to buy themselves. Manumission was possible. It required the owner's agreement and a price, and the price for a man like this was not the market value of a laborer. It was the capitalized value of everything he would ever earn. The negotiations went on for years, sometimes decades, sometimes across generations, a father starting the conversation and a son finishing it. The figures are astonishing. The freedom purchases of the Ivanovo manufacturers ran into the tens and hundreds of thousands of rubles. One of the most famous cost something in the region of 135,000, plus land, plus, in the customary arrangement, the handing over of other serfs to replace himself. That is a sum that would buy a substantial estate. It was paid by a man who had built the wealth himself to purchase the legal right to be a person, and some owners simply refused. The money was not the point for them. A mill that generates that kind of obrok is worth more owned than sold, and a family with 200,000 souls does not need one man's lump sum. There are records of men who could have bought a palace being told politely no, and going home and continuing to run their enterprise and asking again the following year. There is a particular kind of anger in the correspondence of those men that comes through even at 2 centuries distance. It is not the anger of the desperate, it is the anger of the extremely competent, encountering an obstacle that no amount of competence can move. Once free, they moved fast. Within a generation, several of these families were merchants of the first guild, respectable, philanthropic, building churches and schools and hospitals, and the names of a few of them were still on Russian industrial concerns a century later. Now, I do not want to leave you with the impression that this was common. It was not. This is the extreme tail of the distribution, a handful of men out of 23 million. But the tail matters for 2 reasons. The first is that it demolishes any account of serfdom that rests on the idea that these people lacked the capacity for anything more. Given an opening, the North's poor soil, the Obrock system, a bit of luck, and a good eye for cotton, a village of legally unfree peasants built a manufacturing town from nothing in about 60 years. The second is what it revealed to the people who were paying attention. By the 1850s, thoughtful Russians were looking at Ivanovo and at the industrial provinces and drawing an uncomfortable conclusion. The empire's economy was being held back by its own foundation. You cannot build a modern industrial workforce out of people who have to go home in April to plant rye, and who need written permission to move, and who cannot enter a contract, and who cannot be relied upon to be anywhere in particular next year. Serfdom was not just cruel, it was becoming inefficient, and inefficiency was the argument that finally landed. Russia had just lost a war in the Crimea, badly, humiliatingly on its own soil, to powers whose armies were smaller and whose supply lines were 4,000 miles longer. The lesson everyone in Petersburg took from it was that the empire was slower, poorer, and worse organized than the countries it thought it was equal to, and a great many of them, tracing that backwards, arrived at the same place, at a village of wooden houses and a system of ownership, and 23 million people who could not be moved. I promised you we would come back to Praskovia, and this is the place to do it, because her story is the whole system compressed into one life. First, the world she was pulled into. Serf theaters were not a curiosity. At their height, there were well over 100 of them across the empire, on private estates, staffed entirely by owned performers. The performers were selected as children on the basis of a voice or a face or a way of moving, and taken into the house and trained relentlessly. Singing, dancing, languages, deportment. A serf soprano might have better technical training than a free provincial actress because the estate could afford the best teachers and had absolute control over the pupils' time. And they were absolutely, unambiguously property. A whole company could be sold as a lot. There are advertisements. A landowner in financial trouble could liquidate an orchestra the way he would liquidate a stud farm, and there are accounts of exactly that happening, of musicians who had played together for 15 years being dispersed across 3 provinces in an afternoon. There were owners whose theaters were monstrous, men who used the company as a private harem, who whipped dancers for missed steps, whose houses had a reputation that made even other serf owners uncomfortable. And there were owners who were fanatical, exacting, and genuinely devoted to the art, which produced a different kind of strangeness. A house where a young woman was drilled to the standards of the imperial stage by a man who admired her enormously and owned her completely. Praskovia Kovalyova was born in 1768. Her father was a blacksmith, a hunchbacked, hard drinking man in the surviving descriptions on a Sheremetyev estate. She was taken into the household at around 7 or 8 and put into the theater school. She made her debut at 11. By her mid teens, she was the leading soprano of the company, performing under the stage name Jemchugova, the Pearl. She sang French and Italian opera. She was, by every account we have, remarkable. Not merely good for a serf, not a novelty, but one of the finest voices in the country. When Catherine the Great attended a performance at Kuskovo, she was sufficiently impressed to give the singer a diamond ring, and Count Nikolai Sheremetev, who had inherited the theater from his father and turned it into his life's obsession, fell in love with her. Now be careful here, because this is exactly the point at which the story wants to become a fairy tale, and it should not be allowed to. He owned her. Everything that passed between them happened inside that fact, and no account of their feelings can be separated from it. She could not have refused him. Whatever it was not a courtship between equals, and the surviving letters are letters between a man who could do anything and a woman who could do nothing. What we can say is what he did, which is unusual enough to be worth the telling. He did not treat it as a passing arrangement. He kept her at the center of his life for 2 decades. He built a new theater at Ostankino that was in part a stage for her, and when her health began to fail, she developed tuberculosis, which ended her singing career while she was still young. He did not discard her, which is precisely what the pattern of these stories usually is. He freed her. He had her manumitted along with her family, and then he did the thing that made the whole of Russian society turn round and stare. In 1801, Count Nikolai Petrovich Sheremetev, one of the wealthiest and most senior noblemen in the empire, married her. It was a secret ceremony in a small Moscow church with 4 witnesses. He had to construct a false genealogy for her, dressing up her blacksmith father as descended from Polish nobility, because the alternative was unthinkable to everyone he knew. His family were appalled. Society was scandalized. He risked a very great deal, and he was not a young romantic when he did it. He was a man in his late 40s who had thought about it for years. They had 2 years. In 1803, she gave birth to a son. She was already gravely ill with tuberculosis, and she died 3 weeks later, at 34. Almost nobody from the aristocracy came to the funeral of the Countess Sheremeteva. The invitations went out and the carriages did not arrive, because the ladies of Moscow were not going to stand in a church and mourn a blacksmith's daughter who had been on the stage. The people who came were the poor of the city in large numbers, because in her short time as a countess she had spent a great deal of money on them, and her husband, who had another 26 years to live, spent a good part of them building a hospital in Moscow in her memory. Not a monument, a hospital for the destitute with a free almshouse attached. It opened after his death. It treated the poor of Moscow for over a century, and a version of it is still standing and still a hospital which means that the most durable thing produced by that entire enormous fortune, the 200,000 souls, the palaces, the orangeries, the theater machinery, is a building put up in the name of a woman who was born, owned by the man who paid for it. I said earlier that I could never decide whether this story is the most romantic thing in this script or the saddest. I still cannot, because on one reading, it is a man who loved a woman enough to defy his entire class, and freed her, and married her, and grieved her for a quarter of a century. And on the other reading, it is a woman who was taken from her father's house at 7, trained like an instrument, kept for 20 years by someone she could not refuse, granted her freedom only after her voice was gone, and given the highest rank in the empire just in time to be too ill to enjoy it, and who was so unwelcome in that rank that her own funeral was boycotted. Both readings use the same facts. I think you have to hold them together, which is by now a familiar instruction in this story. There is someone else living in your house, and everybody in the family knows it. He lives behind the stove, or under the threshold, or in the cellar. He is small and hairy and old. He is called the domovoi, which simply means the one of the house, and he is not a ghost, and he is not a demon. He is closer to a very ancient relative who came with the building. If you keep a decent house, he is content. He will look after the livestock, tidy small things, and warn you before a fire or a death by knocking or weeping in the night. If you are lazy, or if you quarrel constantly, he becomes irritated. He tangles the horses' manes, breaks crockery, sits on the sleeper's chest until they wake gasping. You leave him a little food, you speak politely about him, and when the family moves house, you bring him, you take a coal from the old stove to the new one, or scrape ashes into a pot and invite him formally to come along, because leaving him behind would be both rude and unwise. Now, at the same time, you are a devout Orthodox Christian. You cross yourself many times a day. You keep 200 fasting days a year. You know the icons in your corner by name, and you would be genuinely distressed to be told you were not a good Christian. Historians call this devoevery, double faith, and there has been an argument going for a century about whether that word is fair. But whatever you call it, the texture of it is unmistakable. A village that goes to church on Sunday and also does not go into the bathhouse after midnight, because the bathhouse has its own occupant, and he is a good deal less friendly than the one behind the stove. The banya is the most important building in the yard after the house itself. It is a small wooden hut with a stove and a heap of stones, and you throw water on the stones to fill the room with steam, and you beat yourself with a bundle of birch twigs to bring the blood up, and then you go outside and roll in the snow. It is the only real washing anybody does, weekly if the household is diligent. It is also, and this is the part that matters, the cleanest and warmest private space a family has. So it is where women give birth. It is where the sick are treated. It is where a bride is ritually prepared before her wedding. And precisely because it is the room where the biggest things happen, it is understood to be a threshold, a place where the boundary is thin. So it is where girls go on Christmas Eve to attempt to see the face of their future husband in a mirror which is a divination ritual that half the folklore collections in Russia describe, and which was practiced well into living memory. But you never go in for a fourth round of steam because that round belongs to the bannock, the bathhouse spirit, and he is not tolerant of company. You leave him water and a bundle of twigs. You back out rather than turning your back on the room. Beyond the yard, the world is populated too. The leshy in the woods, who turns paths around so travelers walk in circles, and who can be escaped by putting your clothes on inside out. The vodyanoi in the mill pond, the rusalki, the drowned girls in the river, who are dangerous in the early summer, and who are remembered uneasily with a mixture of terror and pity. And the whole calendar of the church has older things braided through it. Midsummer, which is the feast of St. John the Baptist, is also the night when the young people leap over bonfires and float wreaths on the water, and the fern is said to flower. Maslenitsa, the pancake week before Lent, ends with a straw figure burned in a field, which is not in any liturgy. Now, why does any of this matter to a story about serfdom? Because it is the one territory the system never reached. Your land is allocated by the mir, and your labor is owed to the estate, and your marriage may need permission, and your son can be taken for 25 years. But nobody in the manor house has any authority whatsoever over what you believe about the bathhouse, the entire inner world, the spirits, the songs, the divinations, the enormous body of proverbs and tales, the ritual laments, the reading of the sky, belong to the village outright. It was made by peasants, held by peasants, and transmitted by peasants, and none of it required literacy or permission or land. When Russian folklorists finally went out in the 19th century with notebooks, they found an oral culture of staggering richness. Thousands of songs, epic poems preserved in the far north by singers who could recite for hours, tale cycles, charms, and a body of proverbs so dense and so good that writers had been quietly stealing from it for generations. That was the property of people who owned nothing, and it is worth sitting with at the end of a long day in a cold house that the wealthiest thing in the village was the part nobody could put in an inventory. Let us talk about what happened when something went wrong, because this is where the system shows its real shape. On paper, you had a landlord who owed you a duty of care. He was supposed to feed his serfs in a famine, and there were decrees requiring it. He was not supposed to kill anybody. He was not, after 1833, supposed to sell family members separately from one another. After 1808, he was not supposed to sell serfs at public auction like livestock. In practice, most of that was close to unenforceable for one structural reason. For a long stretch of this period, a serf was legally barred from bringing a complaint against his own owner. The one person with a reason to report abuse was the one person forbidden to do it. Discipline on the estate was the owner's business. He could order corporal punishment, and did. He could send a serf to a penal settlement in Siberia on his own authority and receive a credit against his village's recruit quota for doing it, which is a detail that tells you everything about how the machinery interlocked. I am not going to describe punishments in detail. You do not need it, and I am not going to put it in your head at this hour. What matters is the structure. The power was real, it was legal, The appeal routes were narrow to the point of theoretical, and how heavily it fell on you depended almost entirely on the character of one family. That variation is the thing that is hardest to convey. There were estates where the owner knew his people by name, kept a grain reserve for bad years, paid for a village school, and manumitted household servants in his will. There were estates run as an absentee investment by a steward paid on results, where the pressure was relentless and impersonal. And there were a small number of households where the owner was, plainly, a sadist. The most notorious of those became famous precisely because she was prosecuted, which almost never happened. A Moscow landowner in the 1760s who tortured and killed dozens of her own household serfs, mostly women, and who was finally investigated after two of her serfs got a petition into the hands of the young Empress Catherine. She was convicted, stripped of her noble status, and imprisoned for the rest of her life, over 30 years underground in a convent cell. And the reason the case echoed for a century is not that it was typical, it is that it demonstrated the whole problem in one file, dozens of deaths, complaints made repeatedly over years, every complaint deflected or ignored because of who she was and who they were, and a conviction that arrived only when a petition happened to reach the top of the state. Which brings us to the petitions, and to the strangest and most persistent belief in the Russian countryside. Serfs wrote to the Tsar, constantly, in enormous numbers. They could not, legally, for most of this period. There were decrees explicitly forbidding it, with punishment for petitioners. It made no difference at all. Petitions flowed toward the capital for 2 centuries, dictated to a literate soldier or a clerk, carried by a delegate who walked hundreds of miles, thrust at a carriage, handed to a passing official, smuggled to a sympathetic figure at court. They followed a form. They were exhaustively respectful. They described the abuse in detail, and they nearly always contained the same underlying claim, which is the belief I want you to notice. The claim was, "Our master is doing this against your wishes, little father, and if you knew, you would stop him." Historians call it naive monarchism. The Tsar was good. The Tsar was the father of his people and the guarantor of justice. Everything wrong in the village was the work of wicked nobles and corrupt officials who stood between the people and the throne, intercepting his true will. It was factually nonsense. The Tsar was the largest serf owner in the empire and the guarantor of the entire system, and the decrees binding the peasantry to the land came from precisely that throne. But it was not stupidity. It was the only politics available. If you cannot appeal to the law, and you cannot appeal to your owner, and you cannot leave, then the only remaining move is to appeal over everybody's head to the one authority above all of them, and to believe hard, publicly, that this authority is on your side. It also had teeth, occasionally. Petitions did sometimes work. Investigations were sometimes opened. Estates were occasionally placed under state administration for mismanagement. A steward could be removed, rarely, but not never, and rarely was enough to keep the practice alive for 200 years. And it had one further consequence, which nobody at court seems to have thought through. If the Tsar's true will is always good, and the nobles are always the ones distorting it, then a rumor that the Tsar has issued a decree freeing the peasants, and that the local landowners are hiding it, is the most combustible sentence in the empire. That rumor circulated, in one form or another, for generations. It ran along the roads with the migrant workers. It surfaced after every new coronation because a new czar might have granted freedom as a gift, and the nobles might be sitting on the paper. And every so often, in a village somewhere, enough people believed it at the same time. In 1773, a Cossack called Yemelyan Pugachev announced that he was not Yemelyan Pugachev. He was, he said, Peter III, the murdered emperor, the husband of Catherine, who had not in fact been killed 11 years earlier, but had escaped, and had been wandering the country in disguise, and had now returned to reclaim his throne and reward the people who had suffered in his absence. Nobody who had ever seen the real Peter III would have been fooled for a second. That turned out not to matter in the slightest, because Pugachev did the one thing that made the claim unstoppable. He issued decrees in the emperor's name, with the emperor's seal, in the exact language everyone had been waiting to hear. Land to the peasants, freedom from serfdom, freedom from the recruit levy, freedom from taxes. It was the rumor made flesh. The good czar had returned, and he had brought the paper. The rising that followed was the largest in Russian history before the 20th century. It spread across the Volga and the Urals, drawing in Cossacks, Bashkirs, Tatars, factory workers from the ironworks, and enormous numbers of serfs who did not need to be persuaded of anything. For nearly 2 years, it was a genuine threat to the state. Towns fell, garrisons defected, manor houses across an entire region were burned, and the families in them were not spared, and the violence in both directions was terrible in a way that I am going to leave as a sentence rather than a scene. It ended as these things end. The army came back from a war with the Turks. The rising was broken in the field. Pugachev was betrayed by his own officers, taken to Moscow in an iron cage, and executed in early 1775. And Catherine, who had corresponded with French philosophers about the evils of serfdom and had privately considered reform, drew the conclusion that any ruler in her position would draw. She tightened everything. The nobility got more power over their estates, not less. The system that had produced the rising was reinforced because of the rising. That is the pattern for the next 80 years. Every serious disturbance made the state more frightened and the settlement more rigid. But Pugachev was the exception, and I do not want you to walk away thinking rebellion was the normal texture of this life. It was not. The normal texture was something much quieter and much more constant. Historians have counted the disturbances, thousands of them, across the first half of the 19th century, rising decade on decade. And most were small: a village refusing to work the domain, a delegation walking to the district town, a steward driven out, a collective refusal to accept a new Obrock assessment. Below even that was the everyday resistance that never appeared in any file. Working the Lord's field slowly and your own quickly, underreporting the harvest, poaching timber from the estate woods, which everyone did and everyone denied, losing tools, grain that mysteriously spoiled between the barn and the cart, arson, which was the great anonymous weapon of the countryside, because a fire in a hayrick could not be attributed to anybody and cost the estate a fortune, and running, always running, down the Volga, into the Cossack lands, into the forests, into the vast southern spaces that the empire had not yet filled in. Whole communities of runaways existed at the edges of settlement for generations, and every landowner's correspondence is full of the tedious, endless business of trying to get people back. Now, the other side of this, which is the part that gets missed, the gentry were afraid, not constantly, not visibly, but structurally, in the way that people are afraid of a thing they have decided not to discuss. A landowning family lived in a large wooden house at the edge of a village of several hundred people who had every reason to resent them, at least a day's ride from any soldiers, in a country where everyone knew what had happened in the Volga provinces in 1774. You can hear it in their writing whenever the subject of reform comes up. The arguments against emancipation were economic on the surface and something else underneath. What will they do? What happens when the restraint is removed? Pugachevshchina, the Pugachev business, became a single word you could say in a drawing room to end a conversation, and it appears in a remark attributed to the Tsar who eventually did it. Speaking to the nobility of Moscow in the 1850s, Alexander II told them, in effect, that it was better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it began to abolish itself from below. Whatever else that sentence is, it is not the language of a man who felt secure. So by the middle of the 19th century, you have a system that almost nobody is willing to defend on principle anymore. The economists say it is inefficient. The generals, after the Crimean disaster, say it produces a backward army. The novelists, Turgenev above all, whose sketches of village life were read by the imperial family, have made it embarrassing. And the landowners themselves in private are increasingly nervous about how long it can hold. 23 million people were waiting inside it and had been for 200 years and had never once stopped sending letters to the little father asking when he was going to do something. He was about to. On a Sunday in early March 1861, the 19th of February by the Russian calendar of the time, a document was read aloud from the pulpit of every church in the empire. Villages had known something was coming for months. Committees had been sitting for years. The argument had leaked, and the rumors had done what rumors do, so the churches were full. In many places, the crowd could not fit inside and stood in the snow at the doors. The priest read the manifesto, which had been drafted in high ecclesiastical language by a metropolitan and was, by common agreement afterwards, close to impenetrable. Then, in most places, someone read the statutes, which were the actual terms, and which ran to hundreds of pages. And here is what people heard. They heard that they were free, that serfdom was abolished, that they were no longer anybody's property, that they could marry without permission, own property in their own name, enter contracts, go to court, trade, and leave. All of which was true, and all of which took effect immediately, and none of which should be minimized. 23 million people ceased in a morning to be owned. It was one of the largest single acts of emancipation in human history, done without a war, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation on the other side of the Atlantic. And then they heard the rest of it. They heard that the land was not theirs. The land belonged to the landowner. All of it, including the strips their families had farmed for 2 centuries. And the arrangement for getting it was this. For a transitional period, They would remain what the statutes called temporarily obligated, personally free, yes, but still owing labor or payment to the landowner for the use of the land on essentially the old terms. This condition was supposed to be temporary. In practice, for many villages, it lasted 20 years. To end it, the land had to be purchased, not by individuals, by the commune, the mir collectively, with joint responsibility. The state would advance most of the price to the landowner immediately, in bonds, and the peasants would repay the state, with interest, over 49 years. 49 years. A child born in 1861 would be paying for his freedom into his 50s, and if he died first, the obligation stayed with the household and the village. And the price was not the market value of the land. It was calculated on a basis that quietly capitalized the old obrok, that is, the value of what the landowner had been extracting from those peasants, which meant that in large parts of the country, the peasants were not really buying soil at all. They were buying out the income stream of their own former obligation. Then came the surveying, and the surveying was the part that produced the anger. Maximum and minimum plot sizes were set for each region. Where a village had been farming more than the maximum, the surplus went back to the landowner. Those slices had a name, Otreski, the cut-offs, and they took a substantial share of peasant land in the fertile provinces, in some districts a quarter or more, and the surveyors were not neutral. The landowner's interests were represented, and the peasant's interests were not, and it is remarkable how consistently the cut-offs happened to include the water access, the woodland, the meadow, the pasture, the pieces a village could not farm without, and would now have to rent back. The household serfs got the worst deal of anybody. They had no land to buy, because they had never worked any. They were freed with nothing at all after a 2-year transition and simply released. 1 million people, many of them elderly, many with skills that only made sense inside a great house, walking out of the only life they had known, with no plot, no tools, and no place in any commune. The reaction in the villages was not celebration, it was confusion, and then, in many places, a specific and revealing kind of anger, because a very large number of peasants concluded that the document they had just heard was a fake. The logic was exactly the logic of the previous 200 years. The Tsar is good. The Tsar has given us the land. Everybody knows the land is ours. We have worked it forever. Therefore, this thing being read to us, which says we must pay for what is already ours, is the noble's forgery. The real manifesto, the Golden Charter, is being hidden. Hundreds of disturbances followed in the first months. The worst was at a village called Besna, where thousands of peasants gathered around a man who claimed to have found the true decree in the text, and troops were sent, and they fired on the crowd, and a great many people died. That is the note the emancipation actually opened on. Not a bonfire and a feast, volleys in a field in April, over a piece of paper that everyone was certain must exist. So was it a fraud? No. And I want to be careful here because both simple answers are wrong. Personal freedom was real. The right to marry whom you chose, to keep your children, to go to law, to move, to own, those were not nothing. Ask anyone who had spent a life without them. But the settlement was written by a commission on which the landowning interest was overwhelmingly represented, and it was designed above all to avoid ruining the nobility. The peasants got their persons, the nobles got compensation in cash up front, and the bill was handed to the people who had been doing the work all along. 50 years later, that bill was still one of the central grievances in Russian politics, and the redemption payments were finally canceled in 1907, not out of generosity, but in the wake of a revolution and a countryside that had spent the previous 2 years burning manor houses. Which is to say, the thing Alexander had tried to prevent from below happened anyway. It just took another 45 years to arrive. So the village wakes up on the 20th of February, free and in debt, and gets on with the spring sowing because the ground does not care about statutes. What changed? Some things changed instantly and completely, and they were the things that had nothing to do with land. You could marry whom you liked. That one landed immediately in every household with a daughter in it. You could not be sold, or lost at cards, or given away, or separated from your children. A fear that had sat under the floorboards of family life for 2 centuries simply lifted. You could go to court. You could be a plaintiff, and the person on the other side of the room could be a former owner. It did not always go well, and the local courts were rough and often unfair, but the door existed, and people walked through it in enormous numbers, because Russian peasants turned out to be extremely litigious the moment they were allowed to be. You could go to school. Village schools spread through the countryside over the following decades, unevenly and underfunded, and literacy began the long climb that would carry a mostly unlettered rural population to something quite different within 2 generations. And you could leave for good without a paper from anybody's office, which is why the cities grew the way they did in the last 40 years of the century. Moscow and Petersburg filled with former serfs and the children of serfs. The mills of Ivanovo and the ironworks of the Urals and the new railway yards took in men who no longer had to go home in April, although a great many of them still did, because the strip of land in the village was the only insurance any of them had. And some things did not change at all, and those were the things attached to soil. The commune held. The Mir survived emancipation, intact and in some ways stronger, because it was now the legal holder of the land and the body responsible for the redemption payments. So the joint liability continued, and the periodic redistribution continued, and the collective grip on the individual household continued. The land shortage got worse, not better, because the population grew fast. The rural population of European Russia roughly doubled in the half century after emancipation, and the amount of land did not. Plots were subdivided, then subdivided again. Households rented back the cut-off meadow at prices the landowner set, because he knew perfectly well that a village without pasture has no choice. And the payments came due every year. Redemption dues, plus taxes, on land that in many districts was assessed above what it could produce. So the picture in the countryside by the 1890s is genuinely mixed, and I will not tidy it. There were villages that prospered. A household with a trade, or a good location on a railway line, or a couple of sons sending wages back, could build a house with a metal roof and a glass window and buy an iron plow. And there were districts sliding backwards with more people on less land, and a famine in 1891 that killed hundreds of thousands and shocked the country into realizing how thin the margin still was. The nobility, meanwhile, mostly did not thrive either. A great many of them took the redemption bonds, paid off their existing mortgages, spent the remainder, and discovered that a landed estate without free labor was a much harder business than the one their grandfathers had run. Estates were sold, cherry orchards were sold. There is an entire genre of Russian literature about exactly this, written by people watching it happen to their own families, and the old relationship left a residue that outlasted every law. Deference and resentment, and a memory in every village of who had owned whom, carried in stories told by grandmothers who had been girls when the priest read the manifesto, to grandchildren who would be alive in 1917, which is the last thing worth saying about all of this. Serfdom ended in 1861, but it ended incompletely on terms that left the fundamental question of who the land belonged to unanswered, and that question did not go away. It sat in the Russian countryside for another 56 years, and when the state finally broke apart under the weight of a war, the first thing that happened in thousands of villages was not ideology arriving from the cities. It was peasants going out and taking the fields and dividing them the way the mirror had always divided things, by household, by need, by an argument in the road. They had been rehearsing that meeting for 300 years, so we come back to where we started. A wooden house on a plain, a great clay stove holding the last of its heat, children asleep on the shelf near the ceiling, and an old woman telling a story in the dark because there is nothing else to do until the light comes. It was a hard life, and I have not softened it. Half your labor went to somebody else. Your son could be taken for 25 years by a vote of your own neighbors. You could be sold, and your family could be broken up, and there was almost nobody to appeal to. But it was not only that, and that is the part I hope stays with you. Those villages governed themselves in the road. They fed their poor and rebuilt their burned houses. They kept a world of songs and spirits and stories that no owner could reach or tax. They walked to cities 1,000 miles away and came back with wages and news. A few of them built factories and bought their freedom for the price of a palace. One of them sang opera for an empress. They were not a gray mass of suffering. They were people doing what people do inside a set of walls they had not chosen, and every single one of them had a grandmother telling stories on a winter night, keeping a family's memory alive in the only archive available to her, which was her own voice. So if you have a story like that in your family, tell it. Tell it to someone. Leave it in the comments if you have nowhere else to put it. It is a very old thing to do, and it is how nearly everything we know about people like this survived at all. Let the fire go down now. Let the cold stay outside. There is nothing you need to do tonight. Rest easy. Sleep well. This is drowsy history.